Good evening, and welcome to the Marine Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Henrietta Toivonen, and I'm one of the Ath Fellows this year. Art has the capacity to provide us with access to the history and the nature of foreign cultures, transforming our worldview without even needing to travel to faraway destinations or having lived at that specific period of time. The empathy that we can develop through art is essential for our ability to understand history as well as the modern day. Today, we will hear about the opportunities and the challenges related to this from the perspective of one of the leading curators in the US. Victoria Sancho Lobis is the Prince Trust Associate Curator at the Art Institute of Chicago. She is an expert in early modern European art and has been leading the museum's efforts to develop exhibitions and strategize collection development in the field of colonial Latin American art. Recently, she organized A Voyage to South America, Andean Art in the Spanish Empire, an exhibition which is the Art Institute's first presentation of Latin American art, paintings from the time of Spanish rule, and she is currently planning a large-scale international loan exhibition featuring colonial Latin American art, paintings, including paintings, textiles, and decorative arts. Dr. Lobis's Athenaeum talk is co-sponsored by the Culture and History of the American grant, provided by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. As always, I must remind you that audio and visual recording is strictly prohibited. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lobis to the Athenaeum.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me in the back? Yes, wonderful. Let me go back one slide. Thank you so much, Henrietta, for that very lovely and generous introduction, and thank you all for the invitation to be here. I'm delighted to be back in Claremont, and especially pleased to have this opportunity to reflect on the Art Institute's first effort in the field of colonial Latin American painting at this very crucial time in our institutional history when we're strategizing how to develop additional projects and specifically how to frame this ambitious international loan exhibition that we are planning for 2020. I'd like to focus my comments tonight on my recent experience with this specific project Henrietta just mentioned, the Art Institute's first presentation of paintings from colonial Latin America that was titled A Voyage to South America, Andean Art in the Spanish Empire. And here are just some basic bits of information about this project. This was a relatively small-scale installation that occupied 2 galleries nestled within our permanent collection galleries. It was on view for 15 months from November of 2014 through February of this year, 2016. So it was on view for 15 months, which makes it a kind of hybrid project between a temporary exhibition and a long-term installation. The installation itself comprised 14 paintings and a rotating presentation of 30 works of art on paper, including watercolor drawings, printed maps, and illustrated books. And I'd like to mention that we were able to undertake this project because of the generosity of local Chicago collectors who have put together one of our country's most important collections of South American paintings from this time. Works from their collection were supplemented with loans from the Denver Art Museum as well as the Newberry Library and a recent acquisition made on behalf of our library, the Ryerson and Burnham Libraries. The total attendance for the exhibition was 450,800 people, and I'm delighted that so many of our visitors could be exposed to this material, which again for us is still in sort of state of development in terms of how we want to frame it, where we want to show it, and how we would like to interpret it. The place of origin for the works of art that we presented was the Viceroyalty of Peru. And I was just talking with one of the students at my table about the quotations I have around the word colonial. As many of you know, of course, Spain did not have colonies in the New World, but rather viceroyalties. But my marketing department told me that viceregal South American art was not going to draw so many people and wouldn't mean very much to the average Art Institute visitor. So, and indeed in the field, there is still a shorthand of colonial Latin American art or Spanish colonial used to distinguish the Spanish territories from those governed by Portugal. As you see on our map, the Viceroyalty of Peru extended from Panama down to present-day Chile, and this territory was later subdivided into 2 additional viceroyalties. But this was indeed the geographic region that we were considering, and art objects from which we were presenting. And I just want to give you a couple of installation shots and I'll return to some of these specific works a little bit later, but just to give you a feeling for how our galleries looked. This is one group of objects. We wanted to show a range of subjects, scales, materials. And here's another installation shot as well. This exhibition is one of 4 to which I have contributed during my 2.5 years at the Art Institute. And for those of you unfamiliar with curatorial work, I'll just say that for any given exhibition, a curator researches a body of work, a group of objects, then selects specific objects to be displayed. We determine where and how these objects should be shown, and we provide interpretation in the form of gallery texts, exhibition catalogs, or brochures. In the case of A Voyage to South America, we also developed an acoustic guide and an application, a web application, content for our web application. And we did it all bilingually as well. So this is part of our sort of exploring different modes of interpretation and display. Museum curators effectively create a viewing experience that we hope communicates the story of an artist, a creative collective, a place, or the resolution to an aesthetic challenge. The objects themselves, we feel, carry the greatest responsibility in that they alone, ideally without the support of our interpretive text, should be able to suggest the narrative that we want to create. I've been fortunate that 2 of the 4 projects in which I've been engaged helped communicate the Art Institute's commitment to Latin American art, not just of the viceregal or colonial period, but also of the modern period. And it's been my pleasure to assume a leadership role in promoting our engagement with Latin American art of all periods to other museum colleagues and within our Chicago community. The Art Institute does not currently have a specific curatorial position dedicated to Latin American art, and so the engagement with the artistic traditions of this region is shared among several different departments. And I think that fact has, in fact, allowed us to be very creative and collaborative in discussing where we should exhibit these works and to have an open dialogue among colleagues who have different areas of specialization. It's been a very interesting time to work in this field. As many of you know, colonial Latin American art has, in the last 10 to 15 years, enjoyed much greater attention, particularly in North American museums. The Metropolitan Museum, for example, just hired a curator dedicated to this field. The Los Angeles County Museum of Art about 10 years ago created its first curatorial position and has very actively grown its collection to represent the arts of colonial Latin America more effectively. And the art market as well has really blossomed, and competition has become increasingly fierce for the relatively few objects that one can find worthy of entering a museum like the Art Institute's. It's hard to pinpoint the specific reasons for this increased interest in this field, but I would suggest that it's a combination of the accelerated development of scholarship within the field of art history. When I worked about 15 years ago at the Americas Society as a coordinator of Latin American art exhibitions, the field of scholarship was just a fraction of what it is today. So there's really been an accelerated growth in scholarly work in the field. I hope that that's one reason that there's increased attention within a museum context. But it may also be that North American museums are increasingly interested in realizing their ambitions to be encyclopedic in their collections, and encyclopedic in a way that also reflects the diversity of our various urban communities. As these two paintings may suggest, the material itself presents challenges in its interpretation and display. As I've learned over the course of this project, there are basic issues related to these objects that have to do with the simple fact that we don't always know who made them. So as you see in the object on the left, we just have to try to identify where this painting was made. We believe that it was made in Peru, possibly in Lima, and it's owing to an inscription on the back of the painting that we're able to give a precise date for the object. 1626 is written on the back of the painting, together with the name of the donor, Baltasar Ramos, and his title. He was a familiar, which is a lay official. He served as a lay official for the Holy Office of the Inquisition in South America. On the left, we have a painting that scholars who specialize in South American painting don't necessarily accept as a South American object, and scholars who specialize in Mexican or the Viceroyalty of New Spain don't necessarily place within that geographic region. So we have a painting in search of a continent even. So there are some very basic issues just related to labeling. Where was it made? Who made it? Some of the basic information that most of us expect to see when we go to see paintings in a museum. Although the field, the art historical field related to Latin American colonial paintings has grown significantly over recent years, it's still not comparable to, say, studies of Italian Renaissance painting or medieval French architecture. And for this reason, we're still working out how to attribute period designations. What do we call a painting made in the 18th century versus one made in the 17th century? Whereas in the context of European art, we can say, early, high, late, Renaissance, Baroque, Rococo, et cetera. Those words, terminologies, are still being developed and ratified by the scholarly community. And as I think you can observe already, the subject matter in itself can be quite challenging. On the left, as I mentioned, we have a painting that was likely commissioned by an officer for the Inquisition in South America. The Inquisition was, of course, an oppressive structure that aided in the conversion of indigenous populations and policed their religious observance. The painting on the right shows a sort of fantasy of the Catholic presence in the New World, with a fair-skinned bishop distributing prayer books to charming indigenous children wearing feathered skirts. These feathered skirts don't resemble any indigenous costumes that we've been able to identify. And so we know that this is a sort of projected fantasy of the role of the Catholic Church, and specifically the religious orders, fraternal orders, who were so active in converting indigenous populations. In the remaining time that we have together this evening, I want to discuss the parameters that were at play for this specific project and its significance for our institution, as well as within the broader landscape of this growing interest in colonial or viceregal Latin American art, specifically in North American art museums. In exploring this case study, I want to consider the following points. How art museums pursue a concept of globalism as motivation for their exhibition and permanent collection programming, the place of Latin American art, and specifically Spanish colonial art, within this pursuit, the challenges and consequences related to the display of Spanish colonial art, some of which I've just sketched, and more broadly, the value of object-based research and public access to art objects as sources for scholarship. First, we can consider what globalism means within a museum context, and I suppose our museum is at least giving some idea of it in our mission statement, which reads, "The Art Institute of Chicago collects, preserves, and interprets works of art of the highest quality, representing the world's diverse artistic traditions for the inspiration and education of the public in accordance with our profession's highest ethical standards and practices." And those are my underlinings. Like many of our peer institutions, such as the Metropolitan Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, Philadelphia Museum of Art, and so on, all of your hometown museums, many of them, I should say, have the same founding principle, the idea of an encyclopedic collection. That is, there's a notion that we should try to represent in one place the artistic traditions of all places and times. That's a pretty ambitious goal, and as this image indicates, it's one that we've fallen well short of. One of my colleagues, in preparing our recent long-range plan, made this map that shows the distribution of the Art Institute's permanent collections, and the countries that are represented have a minimum of 500 objects in our permanent collection. So you can see that even though our institution, like so many American art museums, was created with the sense of representing an entire world of artistic production, in practice, we do much better collecting and representing the art of very few places, most especially the United States, France, Great Britain, Japan, and of course, a handful of other countries that you see shown here. The very notion of an encyclopedic collection is also problematic in that it's bound up with notions of imperialism. Some of the most broad-ranging and largest collections have their origins in gathering works of art as spoils of military victory, and I'm thinking, of course, of the Musée Napoléon, which was one incarnation of today's Louvre in Paris. And this idea of an encyclopedic collection is also complicated by conflicting positions related to notions of cultural patrimony. That is, should historically significant works of art be taken out of their country of origin? When, why, and to what end? The rhetoric of globalism in recent years has at least allowed encyclopedic museums like the Art Institute to re-examine the purpose of representing artistic traditions of many different places within its galleries. And it's an idea to which for which I still have faith. I'm encouraged in that hope and that belief, in part by an essay by Kwame Anthony Appiah titled "Whose Culture Is It?" And in this essay, the author suggested that these sorts of collections allow us to find, and I quote, "connection not through identity, but despite difference." He continues, "We can respond to art that is not ours. Indeed, we can only fully respond to our art if we move beyond thinking of it as ours and start to respond to it as art." And in some sense, this was one goal of our project, to help a Chicago audience see objects that we had not presented before as art on par with other works that we regularly display. The case of Spanish colonial art is particularly intriguing and difficult in both of these senses, that is imperialism and issues of cultural patrimony. And in fact, the seemingly simple decision about where these objects are displayed is itself freighted with questions about the appropriate narrative context, whether it should be European, American, or just isolated as its own independent artistic tradition. And I'll go now fairly quickly through some other models. These are examples that we considered and are still reflecting upon as we move forward with our own plans. So one example can be found in the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, which has recently been very active in building its permanent collection. They also recently launched an exhibition about the influence of Asian art in the Americas. And they have chosen to incorporate colonial Latin American art within their Art of the Americas wing, which was newly designed. Some of you may have visited it recently. And there you will find works such as these, decorative art objects, like this amazing inlaid wood chest from Villa Alta in Mexico, these Castas paintings, portraiture, ceramics, etc. And this is effectively one room in a larger suite of galleries. So adjacent to it, you would see then 18th century North American portraits, for example. The Philadelphia Museum of Art, by contrast, has chosen to display this material within its European art wing, which is up here on the second floor. And they have presented the material both within these sort of faux period rooms, like this one, that has some decorative arts, and then paintings both from South America and Mexico shown together, as well as placing side by side a painting, for example, from Ecuador here from the 18th century next to a French landscape painting by Vernet. And the same is here as well, a painting from Puerto Rico by the artist Jose Campeche with a European still life. The Denver Art Museum has one of this country's most important collections of both pre-Columbian objects as well as colonial Latin American paintings and decorative objects. And they display all of those objects in their original building. This is their new building designed by Daniel Liebeskind. And this is a plan that shows you here in its earlier building, one floor set aside for pre-Columbian and Spanish colonial art. Within that space, they've set aside distinct galleries for South American or Peruvian painting and decorative arts, and then a separate gallery for objects and paintings from New Mexico or New Spain, we could say. It's a really phenomenal collection. I encourage you to visit if you find yourself in Denver. And then here, closer to you all, at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, they have dedicated a floor of their Arts of the Americas building. That's this building, one floor entirely dedicated to Latin American art from pre-Columbian traditions, actually through contemporary art. And so here we have this rather interesting console that was designed by the contemporary artist Jorge Pardo that shows a colonial painting together with pre-Columbian objects. Here is one of their galleries dedicated to colonial paintings and decorative arts. And here I think you can see this view of 20th century paintings and decorative arts, and through it you see a colonial painting. So they're creating a narrative that is region-specific, but goes all the way to the present time. Now, each of these strategies has its own advantage and corresponding disadvantage. I would say the Americas context emphasizes the significance of pre-Hispanic or pre-European traditions, but it also leaves isolated the devotional subject matter, which was not incorporated into North American visual traditions. And I should add that oil painting as an art form simply did not exist in the Americas before the arrival of the Europeans, which is not to say that there wasn't a highly sophisticated and elaborate visual tradition, But if you're looking at oil paintings, one must recognize the significance of the European introduction of the very materials used to make them. The European context connects the tradition of oil painting and the subject matter, but runs the risk of reinscribing these objects with a narrative of conquest. And then the separate treatment of Latin American art emphasizes the distinctive qualities of Latin American culture, but also makes it easier potentially for someone who's not already interested in the material to avoid or ignore seeing the objects altogether. So to consider what we decided to do, return to the principal objectives of this project, which were to reintroduce Chicago audiences to material with which they may have been entirely unfamiliar. And I can tell you from my many gallery tours and talks that indeed many of the most faithful visitors to the Art Institute really had no exposure to this material whatsoever, and I would put that in contrast to an audience here in Los Angeles, who I think on the whole is likely to be more familiar with this material. Our other objectives were to display the variety of subjects, scales, and materials used in the paintings specific to this region, to emphasize the beauty of these works, and by extension, the necessity of their inclusion in our permanent collection, and to ground the presentation in an accessible and compelling narrative. So, what do our audiences tend to expect? This is Van Gogh's Bedrooms is the marketing juggernaut that has taken over Chicago. Our PR department even recreated a version of Van Gogh's Bedrooms in the River North neighborhood, and it's on Airbnb for $10 a night. This is, as you can see, our website says we've been experiencing record crowds for this exhibition. And in my 2.5 years, this is now already the third such project. And this is really the regular diet of the Art Institute visitor. As I like to say, it's the 19th century every day at the Art Institute. And it's my job to try to get people to think about other places and times beyond 19th century France, spectacular as admittedly it was. So in our particular case, we have to keep our audience in mind. And perhaps in part for that reason, we chose to place this project within our European art galleries. You approached the designated space from either from the side of Spanish and Italian Baroque art or Dutch Baroque art, and the space was set aside by these signs. And I then chose to distinguish between the corridor space and the main gallery. In the corridor, we had all works of art related to the subject that were produced in Europe. And in the main gallery, there were works of art entirely produced in the New World. So in making this decision, I wanted to make our choice explicit, not just to kind of passively insert this material in a European context, but to make that context an explicit choice and, in fact, part of the narrative that we were creating. I grounded the project in a theme of biography. As I said, one of the challenges of this material is that the names of the artists are so often not known. And I think for audiences like ours who really build their experience largely on artistic biography, where did Van Gogh sleep? What did he eat? What was he wearing? Who were his friends? With whom did he correspond? We can't give all those stories for paintings for which there is no individual attribution as of yet. And so how do you create a story? How do you create a sense of connection and identification? Each of the works that we included in the exhibition had a representation of an individual who existed, whether it was a cleric, as you can see, in this painting, statue painting, or whether it was one of the handful of attributed paintings that we were able to include. And the sort of introductory figure was this man, someone who I came to regard highly and continue to be intrigued by, Antonio de Ulloa, was an explorer. He was a Spanish naval officer, and at the tender age of 19, he was sent to South America to accompany a French scientific mission. The French scientists were interested in going as close as possible to the equator so they could measure one arc of latitude to compare with a single arc of latitude they'd already measured in France. And they were doing this to try to determine the accurate shape of the Earth. At this time, this is 1735, it was still not known whether the Earth was a perfect sphere or whether it was elongated at the poles. And this is the work of this French scientific mission. Antonio de Ulloa and his compatriot Jorge Juan were there effectively to supervise this French delegation to make sure they didn't outstay their welcome, and to make observations that they would report back to the Spanish crown. They were there for 11 years, based primarily in Quito, close to the equator, indeed, and they moved around going to the capital of the Viceroyalty, which was Lima, and a little bit farther afield. When they returned, Ulloa and Juan published an account of their trip. In fact, they wrote two accounts. One was a secret account that they submitted only to the monarchy and the sort of top officials, and in that report, they identified some of the injustices that had been visited upon indigenous laborers and remarked on other sort of mishandled natural resources, such as mines in South America specifically. But they wrote one account that was indeed widely circulated, and it was called A Historical Report of a Voyage to South America. And this book, which we were able to include in the installation, also lent its name to the title of the project. The book included city plans of places like Quito, where they went, Cusco, Cartagena, where they first made landfall, crossing the Atlantic. But it also had line drawings of Inca architecture and artifacts that they encountered. And we were able to show 5 different openings of this book, which was wonderful. Ulloa met his eventual wife, Francisca, who was born in South America. They were married later in New Orleans when Ulloa was sent to serve as the first Spanish governor there. It was not a successful venture for him, but at least the happy sight of their union. And so these two, and particularly Ulloa, was the sort of mascot and the kind of metaphorical guide to the rest of the exhibition, which I now show you here. An exhibition that included different advocations of the Virgin that were popular, and here we have 2 different representations of the same one. This one with a female donor, and this one small, painted on copper with an artist's signature on the verso. Also included, as I mentioned, donor portraits, in this case, and attributed works in that case. So the idea of biography running through every one of the works we selected. I also wanted to show the specific subjects that come to typify paintings in South America, and one genre is Inca portraiture. The Inca elite were given special privileges under Spanish rule, and perhaps as a reflection of their pride, they commissioned portraits of their leaders, and in this case, one of the Inca queens, Mama Ocllo, or Ocoyo, as she was called in Spanish. These paintings were eventually considered subversive by the Spanish governors in South America, and many of them were destroyed. Those that survive today, in some cases, were either overpainted or hidden. And after the time of independence in the early 19th century, there was a resurgence in this genre. So here we have 2 different representations of the same individual, which is meant to ask the question whether these are in fact portraits or a sort of idealized reference to the Incan past. So in developing this exhibition, I realized and came to note several of the consequences that are connected with an increasing presence specifically of South American colonial paintings, or we could say more broadly, Latin American paintings. Some of those are a reordering of the hierarchy of luxury objects according to the conventions of our own museums. In South America, paintings were not the most prestigious objects. In fact, decorative art like tapestries, silver work, furniture. If you read in the handful of estate inventories that survive, those objects tend to be listed first, and paintings are often not listed at all. There's also an increased desire for the types of information readily available for other objects of the same time period, such as the identity of an artist, the place and date of production. As I mentioned, some of this information simply is not available because of the state of research in this field. There's also an increased demand for the understanding of iconographic elements distinct to these works, and I'll return to that in a minute. There's also questions about a rubric for assessing quality. Should we compare these paintings to European paintings of the same time, or should we in fact try to establish a different aesthetic sensibility or a different aesthetic rubric to judge these works? And finally, there are also questions about the significance of pre-Hispanic artistic production for the interpretation of these objects. So what can we learn by looking at a moche vessel or a Paracas textile that can inform our interpretation of these paintings? And many of these are open questions. And just to give you an example, this is a standard label that we use at the Art Institute, and you'll see right away that the first piece of information we give and that our visitors often expect is the name of the artist, the name, life dates, country of origin. In the absence of that information, we chose to put the place of production as a kind of stand-in for an artist's name. So where we were able to pinpoint a specific city, like Cusco or Lima, we use that information instead of saying unidentified artist or unattributed painting, anonymous artist. That was language we wanted to avoid. This label goes with this painting, which is a representation of a dressed statue. This is another genre subject matter that was very popular in South America specifically. And I have to tell you, when I was writing the labels for this exhibition, our editor asked me if there had been a typo. Did I really mean that this was a painting of a dressed statue? And that statue was considered still today to be the co-patroness of the city of Cusco. So that just gives you some sense of the context and the sort of baseline knowledge within the institution itself. So dress statues are very common subject matter, particularly in South America. And I think you can also see that there's this elaborate gold brocading applied to the painting. This gold brocade is also something specific to the Cusco school, and you see that quite typically in paintings from South America of the 18th century in particular. So how can we present and interpret these works? Well, on the one hand, there's the subject. This Virgin of Bethlehem is the co-patroness of the city. We know the statue is believed to have been given as a gift by Charles I, that she was recorded to have performed miracles. She's still processed through the city of Cusco, particularly on the Feast of Corpus Christi. And what we're looking at is a donor standing here. I'm not sure my pointer's going to work. As if the procession has halted and he's venerating the statue in the midst of this event. There are also these banderoles that give prayers as if we can read what the donor is thinking. So indeed, this statue would have been dressed in elaborate vestments for different occasions. This is one of a series of paintings related to the processions of Corpus Christi by two native-born artists Diego Quispetito and Basilio Santa Cruz Pumacayao. And here we see the statue as one of several being processed through the city. This subject, as I mentioned, is quite common, and what's interesting is the donors. In this case, we think we have a group of Aymara Indians. This is a painting in the Brooklyn Museum of Art, venerating a statue of the Virgin Mary. And in this case, we believe we also have an indigenous donor who's likely paid for the production of this painting. Paintings such as this one that were covered in this gold brocade also could serve an exchange value. There are documents that indicate that these paintings could be willed to a parish in exchange for alms to be said on behalf of the donor. The donor wears his hair long or natural, and this is how we identify him as an indigenous figure, but he's also chosen to dress himself with lace that was likely imported from Europe. We know that paintings such as the one on the right, this painting by Zurbarán, were imported to South America. And again, this comparison asks us to consider the significance of European artistic traditions on the development of painting in South America. In both cases, we have a donor portrait, and in both cases, we see a donor venerating a significant image for veneration, either of the crucified Christ or in this case, an advocation of the Virgin Mary. But I think you'll agree that there are significant stylistic differences. And it's my hope that in making these comparisons, we can begin to identify what is distinct, special, and to be celebrated about the artistic traditions that developed in Latin America. And as I alluded earlier, we have this ongoing question about how to understand the significance of pre-Hispanic traditions with the development of oil painting. And as many of you know, South America had what is for textile scholars still perhaps the most sophisticated textile practice anywhere. Here we have one of the textiles in the Art Institute's collection. And we can begin to consider how this patterning that we see in the brocade of Our Lady of Bethlehem may indeed relate to the complex patterning that we see in South American textiles of centuries earlier. In presenting this exhibition, we were able to develop public programs such as lectures, readings, concerts. We also launched recently an object study initiative that's funded by the Mellon Foundation. This exhibition provided the subject for a fellows colloquium, and we also hosted summer academy sessions. The museum has also developed an advisory council on colonial Latin American art, and that group of professionals and scholars is helping us strategize for the museum's future exhibition programming and collection development. And we were also able to conduct docent training for our some 200 plus docents who then could lead school groups through the exhibition as well. So in presenting this project, we were able to reach a large and diverse constituency, and it's my hope that by making these works visible in our museum and more accessible, that we're also able to inspire a new generation of young scholars who can help us answer some of these difficult questions about the very language we use to describe them. The exhibition has now ended, and my colleague Rebeka Long has prepared a second installation in the same space, which just opened 2 days ago. And if you find yourself in Chicago, I encourage you to see it. It's called Doctrine and Devotion. And in this case, she's taking up the question of the impact of the various fraternal orders and their commissions of paintings in South America. As I mentioned, we curators believe that objects can tell the history of the world. And Neil McGregor, the recently retired director of the British Museum, took up that idea in his project, A History of the World in 100 Objects. He used objects from the British Museum's collection to represent nearly every time period and culture. And he wrote rather compellingly in the introduction, and I quote, "If you want to tell the history of the whole world, a history that does not unduly privilege one part of humanity, you cannot do it through texts alone, because only some of the world has ever had texts, while most of the world, for most of the time, has not. If we want to reconstruct what was actually going on, the object must be interrogated and interpreted as deeply and rigorously as the written reports." And although writing certainly did exist in the Viceroyalty of Peru, the pre-Hispanic societies did not use written language similar to their European counterparts. They kept their records with a textile production called a quipu, which is a series of knots, and scholars are still working to decode these quipus. Beyond that, most of the narrative accounts or documentary sources that exist from this period tend to have been written by Spanish. So we have exquisite records of naval voyages, what was in the inventory of a ship, what was exchanged. We have endless documents about various legal disputes over land ownership or property. But we have very little documentary sources related to the artistic production of this period. There is no lives of the artists as there is for European art of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And so objects like these, even though we can connect them to specific artists, on the left you have a painting by Melchor Perez Holguin, who I confess is one of my favorite artists of viceregal South America, or on the right, Joaquin Gutierrez, who we know made many portraits of viceroys. We may have names for these objects, but we don't have entire narratives. We don't have a full biography of the artist, and we certainly can't assess how these objects fit within their careers. And so these objects, like most of the ones that I included in my exhibition, are objects in search of documents. These artists need to be better understood, and it's my belief that it's only through the collective display of the objects they made that we will be able to write the full story of their creation. Thank you for your attention.
We now have time for questions. If you have a